Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s Foreign Policy Panel Discussion, Aftermath of the Summit, What's Next? I'm Heidi Shoop, President of the Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to hear from three individuals who have long experience with U.S. relations with the nations of Africa and the development of these nations, and who closely watched the recent White House Heads of State Summit with African leaders held here in Washington early in August. President Obama gathered the heads of state of most of the African nations to the first ever such meeting in Washington. The theme of the summit was investing in the next generation, and the published topics included trade and investment, peace and security, and democracy and governance. Over the course of the next year or more, the Council will host several programs looking at various topics related to U.S. bilateral relations with nations in Africa, the strategic importance of these relationships, economic development, and global education programs. Tomorrow evening, the Council visits the Embassy of Botswana as part of our Embassy series. Ambassador Saritsa hosts Council members and their guests for a delightful and informative evening. The ambassador will discuss U.S.-Botswana bilateral relations, the remarkable story of Botswana's economic turnaround, and will take questions from the audience. I invite you all to join us. For far too long, news from Africa has been bad news. Most Americans of a certain age think of Africa mainly in terms of one vast continent of problems, constantly needing emergency support and chronically embroiled in bloody civil wars, resistance movements, droughts, famines, and plagues. And while I'm not here to minimize in any way the difficulties these relatively new independent nations, with the exception of South Africa, most chart their independence from the 60s, have in establishing good government, equitable development, and a secure, healthy environment for their populations, it is also true that there is a new Africa developing today. 10 of the 25 fastest-growing economies in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa, and half their population is under 25. Our panel this evening includes Ambassador Herman Cohen, president of Cohen & Woods International, and a career diplomat. For 30 years, he specialized in African affairs for the U.S. Department of State. He served as ambassador to Gambia and Senegal, and is the author of Intervening in Africa, Superpower Peacemaking in a Troubled Continent. Dr. Ray Gilpin is the academic dean for the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University here in Washington. He has held a number of senior positions, including senior economist at the African Development Bank Group and director of the Center for Sustainable Economies at the United States Institute of Peace. He is a well-known writer on African security challenges and is a frequent guest on various media platforms. Daniel Silke is an expert on South African and African political economy. As director of the Political Futures Consultancy, he frequently assesses African economic issues. He served as a member of the Parliament in Western Cape Provincial Parliament in Cape Town, South Africa, and is a councillor in the City Council of Cape Town. He is the author of a book regarding the future of South Africa entitled Tracking the Future, Top Trends That Will Shape South Africa and the World. The panelists will be taking your questions following their presentations, so please use the microphone on your left of the room to ask your questions. This program is being filmed for the Council's weekly national television program, World Affairs Today, so I at this time ask you to please switch off your cell phones or electronic devices as a courtesy to our panelists, our audience here and at home. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. Ambassador Cohen.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I observed the summit from the point of view of the private sector. I was representing a U.S. power company, and since power in Africa is so important, it was emphasized at the summit. I was taking part in a lot of events there. My personal opinion, this summit is extremely important. I think the only other African summit that I've ever looked at that was equally important was in 1994 when Francois Mitterrand of France had a summit in which he announced it's time to give up the one-party state and have multi-party democracy. This was a momentous thing for a French president to say. And this summit, I think, was just as important. Now, why is that? Well, there's an important message that President Obama was sending to the Africans. What he was saying is foreign aid, as we've known it, has really gone as far as it can go. Foreign aid has kept African economies ticking along at about 3% a year growth, and it's been able to keep up with population growth. But time is running out on foreign aid, and something else is needed. And what is needed is significant wealth-creating investments, which can only be done by the private sector. And the president is saying there are three important deficits which need to be taken care of before you can get these investments. The first one is the power deficit. You can't really have a functioning economy without electric power in the 21st century. The second deficit is the agricultural deficit. Africa is currently in a commodities boom. They're selling a lot of commodities abroad, mainly to China and India. They're making a lot of money, but so much of this revenue is going to buy food. They're just not producing enough food, and the potential for agricultural production in Africa is very great. And the third deficit is the good governance deficit. That is, you're not going to get investors, either African investors or foreign investors, unless you have the rule of law, you have the sanctity of contracts, and the investor can feel comfortable. So what President Obama was saying, if we can move to help solve these deficits, things will improve. Now, and he has put money where his mouth is. He is saying there's about $30 billion in leverage money. In other words, we're not going to put $30 billion into Africa, but if you can make deals with power companies, with agro-industry companies, there's plenty of money available to finance these investments, either from the Exim Bank or for the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. There is money. So, but you have to take care of the attracting the investors. So in effect, what President Obama was saying, the ball is in your court. Don't rely on the United States or other donors to take care of these issues. The ball is in your court. And I think President Obama is the first American president ever to say that, because previous presidents were afraid of being accused of colonialism or neocolonialism. But as a person of African descent himself, he felt safe in telling the Africans, it's your problem and you have to do it. And I think this is the equivalent of Francois Mitterrand saying you must have democracy. And I think we'll get back to some of these subjects later. I'll turn it over to Dr. Gilpin now.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Cohen mentioned three deficits: power, agriculture, and governance. I'll speak very briefly about what I consider the fourth deficit: security. It's clear, just eyeballing not just economic trends, but also security and stability trends across the continent, that there is a close linkage between insecurity and the lack of governance and a lot of the economic challenges, not just in terms of growth, but also in terms of development and equity that Africa has experienced over the ages. It's very, very important that the discussions during the summit also focused on peace and security. There are three important reasons for this. Firstly, because good security constitutes an enabling environment that allows investment to flow and trade to thrive. Secondly, because it reduces the risk for investors. A lot of the assistance is going to be leveraged on private sector capital. and there needs to be a very favorable risk calculus for investors to come in. Thirdly, because it's very, very important when you analyze Africa or prospects across the continent or the likelihood of interventions to succeed on the continent to do it in a very holistic manner. You can't just look at trade or investment or infrastructure. It also has to look at economic development, equity, and security. So very quickly, what was new as far as peace and security was concerned at the summit? I think the president unveiled the new Africa Peacekeeping Rapid Response Partnership, also known as APREP. This is a $110 million a year facility that is geared towards helping African countries, both nationally and regionally, address a lot of the peace support functions that are required. It also focuses on building on existing initiatives like ACOTA, like ACRIC, like the Global Peace Operations Initiative. While this is great, and we have 6 pilot countries, Senegal, Ghana, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda, these are all countries that have in the past demonstrated not just capacity but also ability to respond to conflict across the continent and to contribute to both sub-regional and regional initiatives. So that's the good news. What's my critique? 5 points very quickly. The first is a lot of what the APREP contains is responding to conflicts, not preventing conflict. And most times across the continent, by the time you're thinking about responding, most of the damage has already been done. So at the same time, concomitantly, we should be looking at not just addressing the response issue, but also the prevention issue. Secondly, there's a tension between national and sub-regional needs, because the focus is on countries that could contribute peacekeeping troops, right? But however, most of these countries also have internal challenges. So what happens when the peace-contributing countries have internal challenges themselves? Thirdly, we are focusing on national, as we should, but it's also important to recognize that in most of Africa's regional tragedies, there is an element of state culpability. Some states are sponsors of terrorist groups, some states harbor terrorist groups or extremist groups, and some states perpetrate violence, not just within their borders, but outside their borders. How do we account for this in this sort of peace and security mechanism? Fourthly, it's going to require a lot of coordination. Coordination not just from a military perspective, but also from a law enforcement perspective. And when you think through how difficult it is for us in the United States to coordinate between states and the Department of Defense and USAID, it's a huge ask to transfer this to the continent. And so at the same time as we're announcing the initiative, we should also be thinking about how do we ensure that we have coordinating mechanisms that will allow these African countries, particularly the pilot countries, to implement this successfully. My fifth point is that all of these countries have traditional bilateral relationships in Europe and Asia. Some of them historical because of colonialism, others more recent because of trade. And these partners are also players in the peace and security architecture of these countries. How does APREP leverage what's been doing, and how can APREP be leveraged? Because we also have to take into account the reality in these countries that you have various stakeholders, and it is a complex array of external partners. All in all, it's great that the Peace and Security Initiative is a multi-year initiative, and it's focusing on the right things, but we do still have to answer a number of questions and work with the countries to ensure that we could attain the objectives for which it was designed. I'll stop there.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Silke, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much to the World Affairs Council for allowing me to come and talk to you. I live in Cape Town and I'm passing through DC, so it's a pleasure to be here. Just a few points that I want to make. Firstly, you spoke about deficits. We've had 4 deficits. I think there's a 5th deficit, and perhaps the 5th deficit is for Africa and it's for the United States, and that's the deficit of having the US on the ground in Africa. I've watched certainly the expansion of Chinese interests in Africa on the continent over the course of the last 10, 15 years. And whilst I'm certainly not here to bash the Chinese in any way, I think the fact that the summit took place is absolutely essential to, at the very least, provide African heads of state, African business leaders, with a choice, with a menu choice, effectively, as where they can perhaps look to in the future. It's not just the Chinese anymore. It's not just the EU anymore, for that matter. It does offer those African nations an alternative. And I like choice, and I like alternatives. So on the basis of that, if we don't discuss anything else as far as I'm concerned, that's my key reason why I happen to like this new initiative, long as it might have been in the works, if I might say. I think, though, that if we look at the initiative from President Obama, there are some crucial points just to make on what perhaps that I find important. I agree absolutely with the other panelists so far. But what's very important to me, and again, it relates in a sense to what the Chinese have been doing across the African continent. The Chinese have been engaging in what I would regard as outstanding trade diplomacy. Those Chinese missions across the African continent are there to facilitate trade. They are there to funnel and channel Chinese state institution money very often, together with private enterprise, through to critical projects across the African continent, with a view clearly to bolstering the Chinese economy ultimately. But it's that information gathering exercise from Chinese diplomats across the continent. It's that intelligence that they have been able to gather over the course of the last decade that to me has been most admirable, in a sense, academically, in watching them do their work. And I think that catch-up is desperately needed perhaps from the United States. More resources, clearly, will be needed from the US in US trade missions and consulates across the continent in order to accomplish that. I think, too, that as we look at the follow-on and immediately follow-on from the summit, and I think we've seen it to the credit of President Obama, there has been a move to tackle an interest in Africa, particularly from looking at more niched investments and trade. This is not a kind of one big brush painting the whole continent. I think there are some specific areas of interest for the United States in Africa that really can bear fruit. One of them clearly is to invigorate the nascent, very nascent manufacturing sector on the African continent. Africans don't manufacture. They export their commodities. Very little value added. There's very little value added coming from the continent itself. Now, I think in terms of enterprise development in particular, entrepreneurial investment, whether it's small scale or whether it's even larger than that, that's where the US can really apply its knowledge. And if there's any deficiency and deficit, it's an entrepreneurial or indeed manufacturing deficit on the African continent, which to my mind can only enhance African economies and obviously also provide the necessary job creation that we all want. Africa itself is going to go through, I think, a fundamental change over the course of the next few years. Perhaps we're coming to the end of a commodity super cycle. Perhaps we are starting to see African countries have to look for something else other than the extractive industries that have really been the fundamental base of their economies. And I think this is really a timeous opportunity, in a sense, for the US to come in with their knowledge and deep understanding and cultural understanding of entrepreneurship into the future, to provide that next step for African countries away from the extractive nature of their commodities. Finally, just the final point I would make, look, to me again, the big deal for me about Africa is demographics, population growth. A quarter of the world's population by 2050 are going to be African, a quarter, and of that, 50% will be under the age of 20. So there is a generational issue here at stake, clearly compounded by governance issues, security issues, as we've seen as well. Nigeria by 2100 could have as many as 900 million people. It'll be the 3rd largest population in the world, according to the United Nations figures, by 2100. Lagos will have nearly 40 million people by 2050. Kinshasa, 30 million people by 2050. So there's going to be tremendous pressure as a result of urbanization, tremendous pressure on South Africa's cities going forward, and allowing people to live relatively prosperous, pleasant lives in these cities, in sustainable, smart cities, clearly has to, in fact, from my mind, be an area of opportunity for the United States in Africa. Those are just a few of the initial thoughts that I have on where the US perhaps can go from here.
Thank you, Mr. Silke. Before we turn to the audience, I think I'll ask a couple of follow-up questions of our panelists. Mr. Gilpin, on the security side, do you think the U.S. arrangement with the Africa Command sitting in Germany and sending people out, don't you think that this sort of overwhelms the diplomacy? Isn't there more military and not enough diplomacy for the United States in Africa?
I think that's an interesting question. I think one of the things that the summit revealed was that the U.S. View of the African continent and the U.S. approach to Africa is becoming a lot more diverse, and not just military or foreign assistance as we used to know it. We're now looking at significant investments in infrastructure. We're looking at significant leveraging of the private sector. This had never been done before, and this is definitely a step forward. The Africa Command is in Stuttgart, but there are a number of things to note about the Africa Command. One of the important things about the command is that it's dual-hatted. It has both military and non-military functions. And those of you who listen to follow the news this morning regarding Ebola, our response to Ebola, Africa Command will be part of the response, the initial U.S. response to the Ebola crisis, sending 3,000 U.S. Personnel to Liberia to help not just contain the spread of the virus, but also help provide treatment, training, and care facilities. And that's in the health sector. And so looking at the U.S. engagement on the continent, I think in the past, there may not have been that much of a balance, but moving forward, we're seeing a more nuanced approach, not just to security from a military perspective, but security from an individual, a personal perspective. And the Ebola crisis is one example of a way in which you could use one instrument of national power, i.e. the military, to address what is truly a socio-economic crisis and humanitarian crisis.
I see. Mr. Silke, during the last 18 months, we've seen in the major financial press, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, The Economist magazine, that Africa is rising. There's the place to make money now. We see Goldman Sachs has established an office and various other financial institutions. Walmart, the America's biggest retailer, has bought many stores in South Africa. They're expanding into other countries. So do you agree that something good is happening, that Africa is really rising?
Well, certainly if you look at the official statistics coming out of agencies here and also agencies across the continent, and one might be a little jaundiced about some of the available statistics from Africa, and one can perhaps discuss that. But if you look at economic growth rates, and if you look at the development of some sort of nascent middle class, and to an extent I've heard various definitions, and we could also talk about what really constitutes a middle class African today compared to 10 years ago. There are enough new consumers out there. I'm not quite sure whether those consumers themselves are the middle class or whether those consumers are a consuming class. If they are a consuming class, the demographics and growth of that consuming class is clearly enough to prompt business to look at Africa as an alternative. And in particular, given a relatively stagnant market, not only here in the United States, but let us say in Western Europe as well, or in the broader West, clearly for a return on investment, to offering shareholders what they want, which are improved results on a quarter-by-quarter basis, the African growth story certainly is attractive enough in order to attract the Walmart. You're quite right. I've followed the Walmart entry into South Africa very, very closely. Walmart have come in. I must tell you that it's not always that easy for companies to come in and transplant themselves into another jurisdiction or regional or area. Walmart have not, I think, delivered the profits that they might have hoped just from South Africa, let alone looking at other African options into the future. So the rollout of that multinational business, particularly on the consumer side, may well be a little slower into other parts of the continent than we perhaps have hoped. But my own view is that there's enough excitement, enough resonance, and I think enough market out there to sell certainly fast-moving consumer goods, as I call them, to sell financial services in particular, and also for the IT and for the infrastructural sector, certainly, to compete and secure very profitable contracts across the African continent.
Okay, so that's very, very interesting. Well, I think we'll stop now for a brief break, and then we'll have the audience participation. Thank you.
I did have one question that came up as, in a way, from Raymond's description of the pilot states, and I wonder if there's a danger of a dynamic of a sort of two-track development in Africa, where you have those states that have the infrastructure and maybe getting the attention now that are able to move forward, you know, maybe not quickly, but move forward on the development track, and then states that will be left behind because they are suffering from conflict or for other reasons. And that's a question to everyone.
Thank you so much, Pamela, for that question. I think it's a very valid question because we tend to think about the continent and its 54 countries and how best do we engage most effectively with 54 countries, all of whom have varying levels of capacity, absorptive capacity, and also different types of both security and human security threats. There's one school of thought that seems to think that a regional approach is best. Look at regions, and usually that tends to follow the configuration of the regional economic communities, ECOWAS in the west, IGAD in the east, ECAS in the middle, SADC in the south, etc. But what we do know is that then you tend to have seam issues, and you also tend to have the appearance of a two-track approach. One of the things that is happening with the Peace and Security Initiative is that even though it's starting with pilot countries, it's starting with pilot countries as anchors for regional engagement. And so while the initial focus will be on the pilot country, the understanding is that rather than leave the other countries behind, they will kind of leverage those investments to bring the others on board. How successful would we be with this? That is a challenge. And one of the approaches would be to have probably a two-track approach. Focus on the pilot countries, but also help strengthen both institutions and utilize capacity in sub-regional and regional organizations. Like ECOWAS, like IGAD, like SADC, because that's when you start seeing the beginnings of not just sustainability, but also regional ownership. Another challenge with the two-track, as you described it, is that some countries might feel left out from a policy, even though not from a practice perspective, but policy and appearance. And it's very embedding it in existing institutions and existing mechanisms, you stand a much better chance of bringing the others along rather than leaving the others behind.
Well, it seems to me that the track record is not too bad. If you look at African military operations, say in Liberia, when that country was very troubled, or in Eastern Congo, it hasn't been perfect, but I think they've done a fairly good job of slowly bringing peace and stability to some of these areas. So I think President Obama's emphasis on giving capacity or helping the Africans develop military capacity, I think is the right way to go, in my view.
If I could just from a business point of view across the continent, there's already a two-track Africa. There's probably a multi-track Africa, but there's already a two-track Africa. I've just been to Rwanda with great excitement and optimism and enthusiasm, and I followed that with a very short visit to Malawi with a depression, a hope that the next 50 years in Malawi are going to be a lot better than the previous 50 years in Malawi. Countries with similar-sized populations, similar-sized countries, physical land masses for that matter. Rwanda with a vastly more complex history in a sense than, certainly recent history, than Malawi. That two-track already exists. And I must tell you, I think also there's a further issue to this. There's the issue of social stratification emerging in these societies. Inequality, which I think is rearing its head substantially. And I'm not sure whether many of these societies, just on a societal point of view, are really going to be well equipped to deal with a class delineation, the haves versus the have-nots, which really are now, I think, becoming quite pronounced in various economies across the African continent. I think of Angola near South Africa as one of them, but in many of the other countries, I think that's an issue as well. So within the populations and domestically, there are different tracks, in a sense, for those populations.
And I might add on that is something you don't see very much, but it exists, and that's minority rule. You have a number of African countries where one ethnic group, say, that represents less than 20% of the people is running the country. I'll give you a couple of examples. Ethiopia, the group in power represents 11% of the population. Angola, what strikes me about Angola are the people who are in power do not speak African languages. Can you imagine that? All they speak is Portuguese. That's a wonderful language, but it's not an African language. So the issue of minority rule is something you don't read about in the newspapers, but it creates a lot of tension and instability.
Thank you for your talks. My name is Levi Gettert, and I'm a research analyst with some of the government agencies in international development. And my question is kind of more geared towards the dynamic between how the different partners that are working now with Africa, with China, EU, and the U.S., and who kind of does the best job of separating out the financial from the political when we work with these countries, and kind of the dynamic and what trouble that might cause us. And I like the idea of the market-based solutions because I think that really puts an emphasis on the financial, but I think sometimes we are nervous when we go back to tie in some of the political issues too. I guess you speak to that a little bit, the dynamic between just looking at the financial versus financial and political, packaging that up. Thanks.
So what you're asking is there some coordination between financial and political?
Well, I mean, who does a better job of kind of separating these two out, I guess?
Well, wouldn't you say, I'll ask you, wouldn't you say that the World Bank is really doing the most in terms of financial stability and economic stabilization?
I think the World Bank is, but I think you've seen the BRICS countries, and I talk about the BRICS countries only because of my own country being a prominent late addition to the Club of Nations, talk about an alternative to the World Bank, and in particular look at a restructuring of the hegemonic relationships across the planet. And I think this is indeed an issue facing many African countries as to who offers them the better deal, and what is the level of conditionality attached to the various deals. And I think it's quite a controversial issue, and we could probably have a whole evening and a very interesting discussion about that. And superficially, I would certainly argue that China's advance through Africa over the course of the last decade has been precisely on this issue. China's willingness to trade across the board, not to look at too much conditionality when it comes to issues relating to governance. China's willingness to negotiate and trade with a variety of African heads of state who may be persona non grata, even here in the United States, I think has been a significant factor to differentiate China from the Western world's interactions with the African continent, certainly in finance. So I think the interesting question really is, has the United States themselves, as a result of the summit now, moved into more of a Chinese view of dealing with Africa, where conditionalities are not perhaps as precious as they once were, or whether we will see some sort of further action from the United States on issues of governance and transparency and accountability as a relationship between business and political in future. And I just throw that back because I haven't got the answers yet, but I think we'll wait and see on that.
Okay, my 2 cents worth. I think that the issue of the political and financial being closely aligned is not so much an ideological issue, it's a practical issue. If you take Mozambique, for instance, according to most estimates, if they contract well and the gas starts hitting the market, in about 4, 5, 6 years, they should be receiving about $3.5 billion equivalent every year from taxes, fees, and royalties from natural gas. But to get there, the upfront investment required is about 25 to 30 billion US dollar equivalent. The challenge for the investor becomes, how does one ensure the longevity of that income stream? And hence the marriage between the political and the practical. That's the practical side of things. The realistic side, how does that play out in African countries? It plays out in a perverse form of governance that reverses all the economic and equity gains and welfare gains for the population, because it ends up in a model that reinforces state predation, not just of the resources and the resource income streams accruing from the resources, but state predation over the people. And so there's definitely a human rights and welfare consideration. And how do we ensure that we have an approach that is mindful of those considerations? I think it's one that includes wider transparency. It's one that includes a public-private partnership that emphasizes those essentials, and one also that includes a market-based approach to mitigating that risk, the political risk. And there are a number of institutions and facilities that could help mitigate that risk, so we don't have that close of a relationship between the financial and the political that would lead to perverse and counterproductive outcomes.
There was a famous professor of African studies at the University of Wisconsin. His name was Crawford Young. He's now retired. And he developed a slogan. He said, if an African country does well on its economics, they get a waiver on their democracy. And I think I would agree that the U.S. tends to overlook some of these human rights issues when the business is good, when U.S. companies are doing well, especially in the extractive areas. So it varies from country to country, but you have to walk a fine line between economics and politics. But my point is, more important than democracy is good governance. If you have transparency and you create the enabling environment for the private investor, that really contributes to real development. And when I talk about the private investor, I'm not talking about the foreigner. I'm talking about the African. The World Bank tells us that there's something like $900 billion of African private money stashed outside of Africa. Now, if that could come back, if they have the right conditions where people are not afraid to invest, I think then Africa will really take off.
Hi, my name's Alachia Swakey. I'm a consultant, and I just had a kind of intuitive question for the panel, and particularly for the ambassador. I think it's an odd time for the U.S. to lecture Africa in the areas of security, of governance, and of other things. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, because you attended the conference and interacted with some of the panelists and all of that, what was the panelists, the African heads of state, what was kind of the undertone of not necessarily being lectured at, because these are kind of tried and true ideas that have been floating around for the last, upwards of 60, 70 years about Africa, 50 years or so. But in terms of today, in terms of getting lecturing from President Obama, particularly in areas of, even investment in his own country and security and just American legitimacy, is America even legitimate enough to even really continue issuing lectures to Africa at this point?
Well, that's a very interesting point. I go way back, and I lived in Africa in U.S. embassies for 15 years, and I witnessed a lot of African decisions in the economic field, which were very bad because they were going to lead to declining economies rather than expanding economies. These were the initial decisions made by the first rulers of Africa. And we were instructed by Washington, do not criticize. Just keep your mouth shut. And I was dying to criticize. And we were told we will not be neo-colonialists. These countries are just becoming independent. They don't want anyone lecturing to them. They don't want to be in the Cold War. They don't want to belong to the Soviet bloc or the American bloc. They want to go to their own way. But this was all in the early 1960s. But by the time 1980 came, many of the African countries were in very difficult positions. They were suffering from minus 5% economic growth per year. There was massive debt. Commodity prices were down. So we said, well, what do we do? Our policy is not to lecture to the Africans. So we have to find someone who can lecture to the Africans. We have to find a bad cop. And who was that? It was the World Bank. So the World Bank and the IMF came in and they started lecturing them, and they helped turn them around, and because what they call structural adjustment and macroeconomic stability and that sort of thing. So things worked pretty well. Now, President Obama, I don't think he was lecturing to them. His technique is pretty like Socratic, I think. He asks a lot of questions, and he leads the Africans to come to the right conclusions. And I think he does it in a very subtle way. And they start arguing among themselves about good governance and good economic policy. So I understand your point that we shouldn't be lecturing them. Well, what I'm saying is historically we've never lectured to them. And I believe we should have lectured to them. But thank God we had the World Bank to go in there and tell them to tell the truth to power.
Okay, if I may very quickly, I think one of the things that the summit helped memorialize is this transition from the appearance of patronage to more of a partnership. Because if you look at what's being proposed on the investment front, on the trade front, on the peace and security front, and the governance front, it has partnership written all over it. I think the underlying ethos is that we don't have the answer, as you rightly pointed out. African countries don't have the answer. European countries don't have the answer. Even the World Bank doesn't have the answer. So the way forward is to find the synergies that bind us together, and where we have joint or shared interests, for example, in opening world trade, in ensuring that the rights of every citizen, every African citizen is upheld, in ensuring that we have peace and security, not just nationally but regionally, in ensuring that local non-state actors like Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab don't become global problems. All of those things are shared interests. The important thing is, how do we forge a partnership? And not so much how, because if you not just listen to the reports, but read a lot of the papers that came out, there was very little that was prescriptive. It was, let's solicit ideas on how we can work together to achieve common goals. Is there going to be some lecturing? There's going to be lecturing on both sides. There's going to be lecturing on on our side. There's going to be lecturing on the African side as well, because that's the nature of partnerships. You know, each side will have specific interests, but the important thing is, how could we find those commonalities that allow us to achieve those shared goals? And I think that for me is going to be the crucial test of this particular partnership.
One of the lectures that we got from the Africans was, hey, the Chinese are eating your lunch.
Yeah.
When are you going to catch up?
Yeah. Yeah, can I just say that it's a little bit like when you invite a guest to a party and you really want the guest to come to the party, but the guest doesn't pitch for the party until the last half an hour of the party. At least in the sense of the United States has pitched. They've pitched late, but they've pitched. So when I talk about, you asked the question about does the US have legitimacy? They've come to the party. And to me, that's the important aspect here. But I absolutely agree with my other two panelists. I think it's going to be a lot more competitive. And I think each are going to play off each other in a global, not only continentally, but also globally. And I think this, although it's undefined as yet, and it might not in fact be of great practical significance, but the new BRICS Bank, the new development bank, provides African countries and other developing economies with a different storefront, effectively. And that in itself, I think, will change the modus operandi, perhaps in dealing with the World Bank, as has been heavily criticized by so many over the course of the last number of decades. I think it's a whole new world, essentially, not just for the US and Africa, but also for African nations negotiating their way with the US and with the Brazilians and the Chinese and the Emiratis and the Saudis and all the rest who have interest in Africa as well.
One of the things that the ambassador brought up, but I'd like to hear a little bit about, is that in order for good investment to occur, you kind of need basic infrastructure to be in place. And the example you used was power. But just from my experience working actually with companies that were trying to work in Africa, it's not just about power. It's about roads in and out. It's about having a mail system that is reliable and people actually getting their mail. It's about having a healthcare system that provides a workforce that's well enough to actually come to work on a regular basis, or not always be trying to handle their health and things like that. And I was just wondering, if we could speak to how, we could get to the point where you could get a good return on your investment because you're not completely starting from scratch, having to build a road to get your Walmart truck in to do this and, all of that stuff.
That's a great description. Would you like a job? No, you're absolutely right. For example, port operations.
Yeah.
If you have a container ship in Singapore, that container ship will be unloaded in 8 hours.
Yeah.
You bring that same container ship into Mombasa, the main port of Kenya, East Africa, it'll take several days before that's unloaded. So the operations of infrastructure, roads that don't wash out during the rainy season, water and power. In fact, when I mentioned power, it's basically a metaphor for all these other things that you listed. And that is something that the Africans really have to focus on like a laser beam, because you can't have business without infrastructure. And that goes for the rural sector too. You need irrigation. You need storage facilities. You need roads to market. I remember talking to the president of Tanzania, and he says, you brought in agricultural specialists. You quadrupled our cotton production. He said, but it's sitting in the fields because we can't take it to the port. So you're absolutely right. Thank you.
I just want to say, that's what Africa is working on right now. If you took a map and you looked at the infrastructural developments on ports, railways, roads across the continent, I always think of my slide because I use it when I do presentations. There's an astonishing array of huge capital-intensive projects, be it from Maputo to Beirut to Luanda, you name it, it's taking place. So it's on the move. It's on the move. But fundamentally, the cost of doing business, the trouble is the cost of doing business, as a result of what the ambassador is saying, what we're all saying, is so high across the African continent, it's a further impediment to that level of growth. The cost of a box of Kellogg's cereal in Lagos is 5 times what it is for me in Cape Town, due to the logistic and other bottlenecks that take place. And that's got to be resolved, but it's a work in progress.
My name is Pamela Levy. I'm a student at GW, and as I was listening, I did have a couple of questions. I'm working currently as a research assistant at an international trade consulting firm, and one thing that we talk about a lot is the role of the Export-Import Bank in international trade. And one thing that I noticed a lot when you guys were talking was that there tends to be 2 different trends. There's international corporations from the United States that tend to be going into Africa, such as Walmart, and there are also talks about entrepreneurs in Africa. Do you think that the role of the United States in Africa after the summit will be more collaborative or more kind of a partnership between African entrepreneurs and other corporations and the United States? Or do you think it'll be more American companies entering into the African market?
Look, I think the easy answer, and the answer I'll give is going to be it's going to be both.
Right.
It'll be both. I think from a U.S. soft power point of view, it's critical that the U.S. offer a much deeper assistance other than the corporate interest across the continent. So it is in the corporate social responsibility field. It is in building skills, education, development, capacity, good governance, all the rest of that. That's the soft power issue, which to me is very critical for the U.S. I think the U.S. has lost soft power across the African continent, and that's what I hope, at least. To me, the corporates will look after themselves. They'll do their own research. Whether the Walmarts go from South Africa into Nigeria, it's not imminent, I can assure you, but they will work at their own projects with their own research. And I'd like to see that aspect. It's the soft power aspect, which to me is what I want to take home from what the US is currently doing. And as I keep on saying, at least it's on the table.
Yeah, and the Export-Import Bank could play a very important role, but it also has to reinvent itself for the 21st century. It's still very backward-looking in terms of, well, that's probably not right, but it's still not as aligned to reality and challenges on the African continent as it should. It's in terms of scale. There should be a way to scale down without increasing costs that much to ensure that you have a lot more participation of U.S. businesses on the continent. I always say that if you look at a lot of what China is doing on the continent, it's not that Chinese firms are that much better than U.S. firms, which is why Chinese firms account for over 50% of infrastructure projects worldwide. It's because they have a lot of support from the Exim Bank.
Good evening. My name is Charlize Sampe, and my question is whether or not you can give your insight on the perceptions on whether or not Africa feels like, from at least a U.S. government perspective, that we're too bore-sighted on CT efforts in Africa, and not enough effort is placed on addressing root causes of terrorism, and whether or not, and also your insight into how the U.S. government can partnership with agencies either in Africa or elsewhere, with AFRICOM or other agencies to address those root causes. And lastly, as you project out past this current situation or the effectiveness in the future, if root causes aren't addressed, how effective do you think those CT efforts will be?
By root causes, I'm sure you're talking about young men who have no future, they have no education,
Unemployment,
all they
no
study
voice
is the
in the
Quran.
government. Yes,
They
sir.
don't study math and physics and that sort of thing. Yeah, I think it's basically a problem for the African countries themselves. But to the extent that we've been doing foreign aid, we've done so much to eliminate root causes. We've put so much money into education, into health projects in Africa. But still, it's up to the Africans themselves to do this. And why are all these people working with Boko Haram in northern Nigeria? Well, you have these young people who have no future, who are willing to get in and do terrible things. So, but I don't see how the United States can really solve that problem for these countries, except to contribute to projects and to processes that eliminate the root causes. And much of what we're doing is eliminating the root causes. Any other questions?
Just very quickly, I think that's a really great question, because it begs a broader issue, i.e. what are the root causes? If you take Boko Haram in Nigeria, for instance, are the root causes unemployment and the educational system in the northern states? Or could you go further back? One that I like to point to is Lake Chad in northeastern northeastern Nigeria. Today, it is less than 10% the size it was in 1967. Climate change, misuse, the lake has disappeared. What that has done is two important things. It's destroyed the entire political economy of the surrounding area and the trans-Saharan trade. And secondly, it's caused movements of people groups. A lot of the new entrants into northern Nigeria, particularly those who clashed with the traditional religious rulers initially, are from that area. So it's the root cause the diminution of Lake Chad and the political economy issues. If that's true, it goes beyond Nigeria to resolve. And so I think, long way of saying, I think this is a really great time for us to sit and critically analyze the root causes of a lot of the malaise we see across the continent. Because most times we are targeting a symptom here, a symptom there, and the underlying currents remain. And I think this is a great time, as talking about partnerships, as African countries are growing economically, to start thinking about how do we translate that into both social and welfare gains that will be sustainable over time. I think that's a challenge that we all have.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think it relates back to something that I alluded to in the first one of the points that I made. You know, the real challenge to me, I work in the corporate environment, and the population explosion in Africa is seen as a dividend, a demographic dividend. You know, the real issue is it really going to be a dividend, or is it going to be a disaster? That to me is going to be the central challenge, perhaps, broadly speaking, of all of the factors filtered into that issue. With these millions of people, can we keep them relatively happy, relatively prosperous, and relatively skilled in order to make a reasonable contribution into the future? It'll impact on your on your question, on every single aspect that we've said. You know, my business colleagues tell me it's a democratic dividend, a demographic dividend, but I think, you know, the jury is out. We haven't seen a Nigeria with 900 million people. We've got no precedent, in a sense, for that. We've got no precedent for the 30, 40 million cities that are going to be, you know, the core economic driving forces or the core hotbeds of unrest into the future across the continent. And I think we had a critical historical moment in our dealings with Africa. Great potential, but also potential problems as a result of not satisfying the demands and aspirations of this emerging young Africa. So it's great to be part of this debate at what I think is a crucial time. And I go back to what I've said. I'm delighted that your president has reignited an interest in the African continent. And if it's only that, I'm still happy about it.
Well, on that happy note, I think we will end this debate.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.